This speech, as I said, is Lincoln's first major address. It was delivered in January of 1838. And there's one more fact we need to know about the time at which it was given. Not long before this, an abolitionist editor named Elijah Lovejoy in the town of Alton in southern Illinois had been murdered and his printing press thrown into the river. Now, abolitionists at this time were not very popular at all. Indeed, they were very much on the fringe of American politics. They were no more favored in the North than in the South, and Illinois in those years was as much Southern as it was Northern in orientation and in emphasis. So a mob had developed in the town of Alton and had gone after the editor, Elijah Lovejoy, and he met his demise. Now, this is important for us to know, although Lincoln will never explicitly mention it in this speech, because it was one of the elements in the context that the audience undoubtedly was aware of when they came to hear Lincoln speak. Lincoln chose as his topic for the Lyceum speech the perpetuation of our political institutions. And he began the speech by saying, as a subject for the remarks of the evening, the perpetuation of our political institutions is selected. And he proceeded to deliver a speech that I find really fascinating because it reveals not only the thinking of the young Lincoln, but it also foreshadows some themes that will emerge in Lincoln's later oratory as well. The speech develops a rather complex argument, and I'd like, if we could, to try to follow that argument along. The overall issue that Lincoln wants to discuss in this speech is how we can assure the survival of our political institutions and thereby transmit the legacy of the Founding Fathers. Now, we need to remember that Lincoln is speaking approximately 60 years after the American Revolution, which means that the generation of those who participated in the Revolution is mostly gone, and the generation of those who grew up with direct knowledge or contact of the Revolution is mostly gone. And so what Lincoln wants to discuss in this speech is how can we transmit on a continuing basis the heritage of the Revolution and preserve our institutions. So he begins by counting our blessings and saying we've inherited a wonderful set of circumstances. We find ourselves, he says, in the peaceful possession of the fairest portion of the earth. We find ourselves under the government of a system of political institutions conducting more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tells us. So we have a great inheritance. We've inherited these things, he says. We didn't do them ourselves. They are a legacy bequeathed to us by a once hardy, brave, and patriotic, but now lamented and departed race of ancestors. So we got this legacy. What is our burden? It is to transmit these unprofaned to coming generations. Now, Lincoln is concerned that we're not going to be able to do that because the survival of these institutions is threatened. From where comes the threat? Does it come, he asks, from any other nation, from any external power? And he answers no. And he answers no with such grandiloquence, such overblown statements that you can see this as a mark of the immature Lincoln. Listen to what he says. Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trail of 1,000 years. Now, let me leave aside the fact that Lincoln perhaps overestimates the capacity of American defense in order to make his point that the challenge will not be from afar. You see in that kind of statement the contrast with the brevity that will distinguish the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural Address. But the danger's not from abroad. Where then does it come? It must come from at home. He says, as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. What is the danger he sees? He says, there is even now something of ill omen amongst us. I mean the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of courts, and the worse than savage mobs for the execution of justice. Now, notice that he has identified the threat to our domestic institutions in lawlessness and in mob rule. And he proceeds to offer some examples of the concern that he has just identified. He talked about Mississippi, where he said there has been a whole series of hangings. They began by hanging gamblers, then Negroes, then white men supposed to be in league with the Negroes, and then strangers from neighboring states going thither on business. And he concludes that this continued until, here's another overblown statement, dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest. And then his second example comes from St. Louis, and here he has a single example of a mulatto man who was seized, taken out to the outskirts of the city, chained to a tree, and actually burned to death. And all this, he says, within a single hour from the time he had been a free man, attending to his own business and at peace with the world. And Lincoln claims that these are representative examples of a curse of lawlessness that is going on all over the country. Now notice something very interesting. Lincoln didn't mention the murder of Lovejoy, even though that had happened much closer to home, and even though it undoubtedly was in the minds of his audience when he spoke on this topic. In fact, there's only one place later in the speech where he even alludes to it, when in a list of examples of lawlessness he refers to when people burn churches, ravage and rob provision stores, throw printing presses into rivers, shoot editors, and hang and burn obnoxious persons at pleasure. That's as close as he comes. And it's worth asking ourselves, why would Lincoln omit such an obvious example in order to talk about people hanging from trees in Mississippi rivaling the Spanish moss? Well, it seems to me, there's all sorts of answers to that question, but it seems to me that Lincoln is reflecting here an interesting principle of persuasion. Most audiences don't like to be called to account for their own failures and misgivings, and it may be easier for Lincoln to discuss this subject with his audience by talking about far-away examples than by examples close at home. But this is a subject about which people continue to speculate. So, there is this epidemic of lawlessness. Why does it matter? After all, one might say if the only harm was the harm to these gamblers themselves, then while it may be an injustice, it certainly would not threaten the perpetuation of our political institutions. So Lincoln devotes a large part of the speech to arguing that the consequences of these acts are serious. And they're serious because they're not limited to the victims, but rather they encourage lawlessness in others. As Lincoln puts it, by such examples, by instances of the perpetrators of such acts going unpunished, the lawless in spirit are encouraged to become lawless in practice. So people who break the law and get away with it will encourage others to break the law. And what does that do? If it becomes apparent to the general population that the government is powerless to deal with law-breaking, then something very important will happen. Namely, the attachment that people feel to their government, their identification with the government, will be weakened considerably when they see that the government can't even take steps to protect them against these acts of lawlessness. Again, as Lincoln says in the speech, disgusted with a government that offers them no protection, they're not much averse to a change in which they imagine they have nothing to lose. Thus then, by the operation of this mobocratic spirit, notice, by the way, the play on words here of democratic, by this mobocratic spirit, which all must admit is now abroad in the land. Remember, he started off the speech by saying, I kind of think this is there. He now says, all must admit it's abroad in the land. By the operation of this spirit, the strongest bulwark of any government may be effectually broken down and destroyed. I mean, the attachment of the people. Now, this is a theme, by the way, that Lincoln will refer to throughout his life, the importance of the attachment of the people to their government. Lawlessness will break it down. And what happens when it's broken down? Then, he argues, people will be less inclined to resist when a would-be demagogue or tyrant, an ambitious person, arises in their midst. And as a result, our liberties will be threatened. The detachment between the people and their government will inspire ambitious men to introduce tyranny. Men of sufficient talent and ambition, Lincoln said, will not be wanting to seize the opportunity, strike the blow, and overturn that fair fabric which for the last half-century has been the fondest hope of the lovers of freedom throughout the world. So now let's quickly recapitulate what Lincoln's argument is about the danger to our political institutions. It doesn't come from abroad. It comes from at home through a growing epidemic of lawlessness, of which he provides examples but omits the one that's most obvious to his audience, and suggests that the harm in all this is that it encourages others to break the law, and that the inability of the government to control law-breaking will weaken people's attachment to the government, and that in turn will invite ambitious and tyrannical men. And of course, if that happens, then our political institutions will not survive, and we will not be able to transmit them to our posterity. So at this point, Lincoln switches to what he believes is the cure that will enable us to overcome the danger that he has just identified. And his selection of the cure is interesting as well. Lincoln sees as the cure for this situation strict obedience to the laws. This, of course, is the counterweight to the epidemic of lawlessness. Strict obedience to the laws. He says, how shall we fortify against this danger? The answer is simple. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity, notice again the overblown phrases, swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country and never to tolerate their violation by others. Notice, incidentally, a beautiful irony in that statement. For what, after all, was the Revolution, if not the breaking of laws? But by the blood of the Revolution, he wants everyone to swear never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country or to tolerate their violation by others. This would become, as he put it, the nation's political religion, strict adherence to the law. Incidentally, this reflects his Whig political philosophy with its emphasis on orderly procedure and deference to leadership, and with its invocation of the mob as the danger or as the enemy which must be combated. Lincoln, in fact, went so far as to say that even bad laws should be observed and obeyed until they are repealed. So the Lincoln of this speech does not contemplate anything like civil disobedience. He says there is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law. He acknowledges that there are bad laws, but says that although bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible, still, while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously adhered to as well. Because, of course, if you tolerate the breaking of bad laws, then you encourage lawlessness, which will lead in turn to the breaking of good laws. So that's his diagnosis of the problem. That's his proposed solution. Now, it may strike us, as it probably struck some in Lincoln's audience, that he is a prophet of gloom and doom. After all, on the surface, the nation is enjoying good times. As he himself acknowledged at the beginning of the speech, all the blessings that we have inherited. And so one might legitimately ask in one's mind, well now, Lincoln, if what you say is true, how could the country have survived these past 60 years? And so Lincoln devotes a section of his speech to dealing with that question. The rhetorical term for what Lincoln does is he engages in anticipatory refutation. That is, he imagines an objection that might be in the minds of his listeners, and he proceeds to answer that objection. And he says, in fact, we shouldn't take any satisfaction from the fact that the nation has survived until now, because there are special circumstances that explain that, and those special circumstances are no longer with us. What are the special circumstances? Well, they have to do with the nature of the revolution. He said, look, the founders were ambitious people too. They were ambitious people, but unlike us, they had a constructive way in which to give vent to their passion for ambition. The way they were able to do it was through support of the revolution. So, for example, he said that our government should have been maintained in its original form is not much to be wondered at. It had many props to support it, which are now decayed and crumbled away. And here's the first prop, that for the founders, their all was staked upon the success of the revolution. Their destiny was inseparably linked with it. Their ambition aspired to display before an admiring world a practical demonstration of the truth of a proposition, namely the capability of a people to govern themselves. If they succeeded, they were to be immortalized. So they had this lofty project toward which they could direct their ambition. But that's already happened. And yet, people will be no less ambitious in former times than they have been until now. As he put it, new reapers will arise, and they too will seek a field. It is to deny what the history of the world tells us is true, to suppose that men of ambition and talents will not continue to spring up among us. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. So where in the past ambition could be expressed through the revolution, that's already happened. And in the future, the danger is that it will be expressed through lawlessness. But that's not all. There's a second thing that Lincoln mentioned that was unique to the founding generation and no longer with us. And that was the effect of the revolution on the passions. He says, the jealousy, envy, and avarice, which he regards as part of human nature, were for the time in great measure smothered and rendered inactive. They were smothered, of course, by the common project of the revolution. While the deep-rooted principles of hate and the powerful motive of revenge, instead of being turned against each other, were directed exclusively against the British nation. So in other words, not only did people have a constructive outlet for ambition, but they had a constructive outlet for their passions. Hate and revenge were directed against the British. Greed and other passions that might be self-destructive were temporarily sublimated. And this had a positive effect, and yet it's an effect that has diminished with time. For the revolution, Lincoln says, is no longer the active object of our passions. It is receding into history. And of course, we know this is true because we know that the generations that had any direct contact with the revolution were dying by this time. So what Lincoln says is we're transforming the revolution from personal experience to history. And as we do that, while we'll continue to study it, and read about it, and hear about it, it won't have the same effect of constructively channeling our ambition and our passions. So, the danger. Even though the country has survived for 60 years, still the perpetuation of our political institutions is in danger. Unless we can replace the devotion that our ancestors had to the revolution with strict adherence to and reverence for the laws. So the law will serve for our generation as the revolution did for the generation of our fathers. He concludes, referring to the revolutionary experience, they were the pillars of the temple of liberty. And now that they have crumbled away, that temple must fall unless we, their descendants, supply their places with other pillars hewn from the solid quarry of sober reason, which, remember, we're going to swear upon the blood of the revolution to adhere to. Passion has helped us but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason must take its place. And he concludes with a plea that those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular, a reverence for the Constitution and laws.